emergence of the United States of America as a world power is a fascinating story and has found many authors. Among them, Samuel Flagg Bemis and Bernard Bailyn are the traditional diplomatic historians. Specialist authors like Alan Nevins has written elaborately on the emergence of the United States as a world power. Then we have George Kennan, the career diplomat who went to Moscow as the ambassador, writing a fascinating analysis of America's emergence as a world power in his book American Diplomacy. For local details, we depend on the works of Julius Franklin Pratt, who had earlier written The Expansionists of 1812 and followed it up with another book called The Expansionists of 1898. We mostly depend on this repertoire. In order to understand this topic, Dr. Chittabrata Palit points to 5 important signposts: the Industrial Revolution and its aftermath, the loss of the frontier in 1890, conservation of military energy, the desire to become a world power, and revival of the Monroe Doctrine.
United States were producing not only the mineral goods, they were producing capacity iron and steel products. They had enough of coal, enough of oil, then all the other metals like copper, bronze, silver, gold, all these things they had in surplus. They wanted to export much of it because the domestic market was shy. There was not enough purchasing power to absorb all these industrial goods within the country. Apart from domestic consumption, they wanted to sell them abroad. Because many of the old world countries, they had not the benefit of these inventions and discoveries. It has been already argued by historians of colonialism that, like Furnival and others, that in the modern century, the colonialism was one of surplus capital rather than surplus of men. It is a surplus of capital. They had so much of wealth concentrated, accumulated inside the New World that they wanted to invest abroad for not only getting market, but also to corner international business.
So, sir, is it because of this that the economic factor is the main factor?
I would think so. That's why I have placed it first, because this is the key factor. Then there were other factors which would augment it, which would reinforce it. That is there. But this is the central factor. Because you have a surplus, you want international market. Because you have a surplus, money surplus also, that you want to occupy the world stage. Because you have arrived, you wanted to show to the world. You showcase your achievement. For that, you wanted to become a world power. So this is the material basis of imperialism. And this has to be reckoned as factor number 1. There was a crisis in America after the loss of the frontier in 1890. America was used to the expansion towards the West. And on that, the famous F.J. Turner had written his famous frontier thesis, that America could always offer equal opportunities to all people. They never had a close-paced existence. They always could expand internally. There was an internal expansion in the United States. And that absorbed all the shock of the settled areas of the East. They could move to the West. There was always a slogan that there is lack of opportunity in the East in the close-paced existence. So let us move to the West. And generations of Americans had moved to the West until and unless it was finally stopped by the natural boundaries. And that boundary was the Rocky Mountain and the Pacific Ocean. So up to that, there was no turning back for America. They were expanding internally. But suddenly that opportunity was closed. And the Americans wouldn't compromise with a ration diet of prosperity. They would not reduce their standard of living. They didn't know how to adjust with other people. They only wanted to have their full share of the cake. And for this reason, they egged on the government, federal government, to take action so that the frontiering was not stopped. So what would be the new frontier for them? The new frontier naturally would be the seafront. And they therefore demanded the United States should become a maritime power, and they should acquire colonies in the Far East, Near East and Far East.
So then do you think it has a frontier legacy of expansion?
I should suppose so. Because, there is a momentum in American history. That momentum was built up by this great conveyor belt known as the American frontier, Western frontier. So because of this momentum, they didn't want to lose this momentum. This factor was very much there. So the material basis was prepared through Industrial Revolution, but the motivation was also very important. That motivation had come from this factor, that they would not compromise with quality of life. They would go on and on, on and on. And if necessary, they would emerge as a maritime power, acquire colonies, and continue their opportunities of living there in the new areas, new territories. So we'll talk about that in its right place. I would like to highlight the next factor, which is also partly psychological and partly military. This factor is that the United States had only the Civil War. After that, they did not have a major war at all. Meanwhile, they had only conserved energy. Meanwhile, they had only conserved their military preparedness, which they had diligently done. They had a huge task force. They had the latest weapons. They had the latest warheads. And beginning from the West Point Naval Academy, they had also expanded their fleet. And the final expression was the making of the 7th Fleet to patrol the Pacific. So they had a huge buildup of army and navy and weapons. It's a veritable arsenal of the world. And for this, they needed a war to exhaust these resources. So it was something like expand or explode, the law of physics. So they wanted an explosion at this stage. And this was backed by the jingos of the country, the young next generation who had not seen any war at all. Their fathers had seen at least the Civil War. But these people, younger people in the 20s and 30s, they had not seen any war at all. They thought that they were tired of hearing the glory of their forefathers. They wanted to, enough of Washington, enough of Jefferson, enough of Lincoln. They wanted to find new heroes and or wanted to become heroes themselves. And therefore, they would like to throw a fist to the world and say that we have arrived. And from that psychology also, the jingos became a big lobby, the military hardware lobby, the war lobby in the White House. And they were very powerful, and they were pressuring the government to adopt an aggressive foreign policy as far as possible.
So then, was it more of a psychological expression than a war preparedness?
War preparedness was there, but war preparation is not always, that does not always lead to actual war or expansion. Preparedness is, deterrent for war, and they work for peace actually. So military preparedness is not always same as actual warfare. Many countries, even today in the Cold War period, they prepare militarily. But that is only a deterrent to any kind of aggression by other powers. And that actually works for peace. So military preparedness is a condition for world peace. But here something different was being enacted. It was actually leading to a war. This is because of this strange psyche of the American people, the jingos, the new generation of people who wanted to show their muscle power. They wanted to show that they would also like to achieve something because they have enough power. A spark was needed to ignite the flame. And the spark was provided by the jingos. So that factor I cannot rule out. England, France, Germany, Spain, all of them had colonies. All of them had colonies. Germany started late during the time of Bismarck. But then Germany also caught on and had several colonies in the world, particularly at the expense of Africa and Asia. But they had. All the powers had colonies. And they naturally dangled that before others, showing that, yes, we are the world power, you are not. We have the colony. The United States wanted to match up to it. They also wanted to dangle something before them, that this is our colony. It's something, like a diamond necklace around the neck. So something like that they wanted to show to the world. And for that reason also, this is also a psychological factor. But unless you are backed by power and goods, you cannot really give priority to psychological factors. So they had the equipment for war and they had the psychology at the same time. Both these were operating. They actually are symbiotic factors. So that exactly is the case, and therefore we find that colonies became certainly a hallmark of your progress towards world power.
So, sir, with colonies and all, America, did it live out on its new hemisphere idea?
Yes or no, both are the answers. As to yes, I would say certainly once you become a jingo power, you become an imperialist power only at the cost of the democratic rights, human rights of other people who are weak. And there you abandon democracy or human rights. New hemisphere idea about which Whitaker has written an excellent book, but he also admits that towards this period, towards the end of the 19th century, there was a steep decline of the new hemisphere idea. Certainly, United States had departed from their old stand for democracy or human rights, that they are the saviors of the world. Certainly, there is a change in the Monroe Doctrine from what we know as isolationism to expansionism. So, the democratic ideas were abundant. But on the other side, I said no, in the sense that wherever they interfered in the neighborhood or outside in the Pacific, they went into the war in those areas in the name of preserving democracy, making the world safe for democracy, for human rights. There, the weaker people were smarting under tyrannical rule, and they were like Sir Galahad's to rescue the Holy Grail. So that was the attitude. So they justified, the rationale of their intervention was that they were doing it for the democratic rights of the suffering people in these countries.
So,
or
sir,
colonies.
did they actually believe in this, or was it a pretense?
They think that, well, they were actually saving the world for democracy. They actually believed that they were the champions of democracy, human rights, etc., freedom of the press, and so many other things. But they're not sure, they're not even aware that they were themselves violating those norms. They're not sure. Even today, they have so much of smugness that they don't understand. So I would say that it is smugness rather than pretense. Monroe Doctrine, as you all know, was at the time of James Monroe in 1823, when the United States was a trembling lamb, a weak power, and couldn't defend her own rights. And at that time, they thought that they must show off that they were a power to reckon with. And unless you show off or pretend that you might accost any kind of aggression by the old continental powers, you would be simply smothered. From that point of view, Monroe had pleaded his Monroe Doctrine, which was originally a Monroe Message, a white paper. But gradually it developed into a doctrine as the United States became powerful, it became a doctrine. It is a period of confidence, age of confidence for the United States. So that confidence had come from Industrial Revolution, from war preparedness, for the jingo psyche of the people, from all these the confidence has been generated. And on that basis, the Monroe Doctrine has this transformation from isolationism to expansionism. It is a reality show, no longer acting, but a reality show. And its manifestation we find in their intervention in several areas. We know at the time of McKinley, the president in the early 1880s, and followed by Grover Cleveland, the next president in the first term, they had already started acquiring territories in the Pacific. They had gone into Haiti in the name of saving the people of Haiti. They simply replaced the Spanish authority by their own authority. Then they took Samoa. Then they moved toward Hawaii. And I have already quoted that in Hawaii also they thought that they were rescuing people, but actually they were not. They were having an American colonization of Hawaii in this way. And they are integrating these colonies into the American Republic. They became the states of the United States. But worse than that, they also wanted to have their authority expressed in the operation of the Panama Canal. Panama Canal was an agreed international waterway to go into Central America, to go into Latin America. This was ensured by an earlier act known as Clayton-Bulwer Act of 1850. In that Clayton-Bulwer Act of 1850, we find that United States agreed with UK that Panama Canal was opened at that time, that Panama Canal should be an international thoroughfare, mainly for peace and commerce, and no aggression. This was the stand of United States, and UK also nodded in. But by 1901, when Theodore Roosevelt was there as the president, he used to speak softly but carry a big stick. That was Theodore Roosevelt's diplomacy. He threw in a thing called Roosevelt Corollary of 1901. Now, in this corollary, Theodore Roosevelt argued that United States must take over the management of the canal system from UK because it was their territory. They must control the waterway. The US hegemony was being sounded here by these Roosevelt corollary. And UK had become, softer. They could not protest against the United States superiority. They had to acknowledge the challenge thrown by United States under Theodore Roosevelt. And this being the case, we see the complete expansion of the Monroe Doctrine into something, a doctrine of expansionism. And in this way, Monroe Doctrine has been transformed. It was no longer a document of peace. It is a war document now. It's a war document. Threat of war is the guarantee for peace, it is said. So this is the threat of war. You can pose in such a way only when you are really powerful. They were sure that UK could do nothing, coming all the way 3,000 miles across Atlantic to challenge the might of United States. United States would have a field day, and they would control this canal, and UK would not be able to do anything about it. This is called diplomacy of brinkmanship. So this is something called brinkmanship. You go to the extremist challenge, you can say. You go to the extremist challenge, waiting for war to come. Because you are fully prepared. You want war. Your psyche is for war. And when you are in such a bellicose mood, the power who would like to say that no, you have to honor the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, they became chicken-hearted. They couldn't do that. They couldn't do that. UK had to surrender meekly to this warlike stand of Theodore Roosevelt. And ultimately, this right was conceded to the United States that they would control the management of the Panama Canal as an international waterway. So in this way, Monroe Doctrine went to the extremes. It had a full expansion. And after that, of course, people of Panama, in the Panama Conference that took place in 1901, the Hay-Ponsford Treaty had already replaced the Clayton-Balboa Treaty in 1901 as a result of Roosevelt corollary. And in the Panama Conference, however, they found a different kind of mood of the local people and many of the Latin American people. They didn't like this big brother attitude of the United States. They totally rejected this whole idea of picking the chestnuts of somebody else's fire. They thought that the United States was only replacing the continental hegemony by its own. So Monroe Doctrine was being challenged and rejected by the Latin American powers. It will be rejected, of course, by 1940, by the Greenland Conference or Montevideo Conference in 1938. But even before, we have the first, we can say, first nail driven into the coffin of the Monroe Doctrine. That was sounded in the Panama Conference of 1901. So this is then the trajectory of the Monroe Doctrine in connection with the America's emergence as world power. All these factors combined to make America the world power. But George Kennan, the famous author, a Marxist author, who had pointed out, unless you are powerful, you don't exhibit power. Others are exhibitionisms. But main thing is you have something to exhibit. And this was created by Industrial Revolution, according to George Kennan. He thinks that it's a dormant factor, but it's the main factor. Others are exhibitionisms. Later on, the whole thing was ignited. But the combustibles were there. And the combustibles were the real factors behind the American imperialism. And I would heartily agree with George Kennan's formulation that this was so.
In this episode, Dr. Chittobroto Palith has dwelt upon the emergence of the United States of America as an imperial power through various means. The Industrial Revolution provided her with a large volume of both capital and consumption goods to do trade with in domestic and international markets. An enormous surplus of capital was thus generated, which helped her put the economy on a solid financial footing. The loss of the Western frontier and its psychological impact prompted the American people and government to explore the sea front and seek out expansion in the overseas territories. When internal stability was restored after the Civil War, the military resources were available for conservation, although there was no laxity in military preparedness. Gradually, there emerged a jingoist lobby within the nation who wanted war at all costs to show that America had arrived. The constant propaganda by the jingoist lobby instilled within the American people a desire to become a world power. To be bracketed with the imperialist continental powers, the United States of America needed to show her political influence beyond her borders. One sure way to do that was to acquire colonies and protectorates. Since the last quarter of the 19th century, the United States of America proceeded to do exactly that. In so doing, she took recourse to the Monroe Doctrine, which emphasized distinct American and specifically U.S. interests. By constantly expanding the meaning of the original assertion of President Monroe, she began to establish her hegemony over her neighbors and Latin America. All this was being done in the name of keeping European nations and their political systems away from the American continents. Despite resentment of her neighbors, the United States of America vigorously pursued her goal to become a world power. The United States of America was no more a country holding out hopes and promises for others. She was transformed into a powerful one.